Hey.
Hey, oh, hey, look,
Yeah,
something just
that
happened.
kind of hey.
Oh, hey.
Okay, so it looks like the stream was deleted on Facebook. Oh my God, I don't
Uh,
know what's going on here. Okay, so welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. Chris, where are you? Calling Chris Anderson. I don't know
I
where.
am in Dresden tonight, so yeah, I'm on the site inspection for our 80th anniversary VE Day tour, seeing all kinds of cool stuff. Started this morning at Colditz Castle, and this afternoon German Army Museum and some sites around Dresden. And tomorrow we're going to go down to or up to Torgau to see where the Red Army and the Americans linked up.
Wow, fantastic.
And you
Well,
are, looks like you're in Chicago.
I'm here in Chicago, looking at why we're not getting anybody on the Facebook pages. But I guess all the people who are joining us are YouTube people, and the other people will, I guess, figure it
Figure that
out.
out.
I don't know. Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show and for sending Chris around the world there, and there he is in Dresden. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And whether you're watching live, watching on replay, listening on the HHH
Podcast.
podcast,
You
okay,
got
we're
my show.
glad you're here. And today we're going to be talking about the Axis powers' views of the United States during World War II. Let us know, everybody, what you're drinking. Okay, that's an important part of the show. And meantime, I would say that we should thank everybody who is a Patreon supporter,
Absolutely.
Chris.
Absolutely.
We appreciate all of you, especially our top shelf patrons. And you can become a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/history happy
Happy
hour.
hour.
Yeah. Um, so we have some people here, Chris, despite our
Lots of
technical
people.
difficulties. Who's with us?
Well, we have Xavier, so we can start. So our
Xavier's
Spanish can. We are
present.
now an international audience. Lizzie Borden as
Yes.
well from London. Barry Milgate from Stafford. So we are international. Liz Mumford, Lynn Hargrove, Wally. So lots of our friends, some new folks.
Many people, and if we've made it hard for them to find us, they're figuring it out. So we admire them for that. So
Yes.
Chris, give me a cue, and why don't we get this show underway?
The bar is open.
The bar is open. Hey, Chris, why did Axis countries go to war against America?
Because they
And
were
given,
crazy.
yeah, all right, that's it.
All right.
Thank you, everybody,
Okay.
for joining us today. And given America's industrial base, what was the rationale that underpinned their decisions? When did they realize they couldn't win? We're going to talk about some of those things today with Harry Yeide. And Harry is the author of the book Betting Against America, the Axis Powers' Views of the United States. And he's a foreign affairs analyst who writes primarily in the field of military history. He has written a number of books, mostly about World War II tanks. I think that's fair to say. And so, Harry, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm happy, and we have an hour, so
There you go. You've
everything's
got it.
lined up.
I have to check in with everybody if they brought a cocktail or not. I don't know. Harry, did you bring a drink?
Got a brewski.
There you
Okay,
go.
awesome.
Yep.
Chris, Mr.
Well,
Anderson,
the
in
mini bar
Dresden
wasn't.
Hotel.
The mini bar wasn't
Oh
great in
my God!
Dresden,
You
but
know,
I did make a pit stop before I got here. So this is water, but it wasn't water earlier.
you're living off your past.
I
It's
am
I
enjoying my
don't.
life. And
I
you?
have an Abbé Left beer. Good solid Belgian
Well
beer.
done, sir. Well done.
Harry, listen, let's jump into this. Lots of ways that we could start this off, but let me say this. You suggest that your book is a red team exercise. So can you explain for people who might not know what that is and kind of what makes your book different than the many books that have been written about World War II and how it got started?
Sure thing. A red team exercise is a phrase that goes back to the Cold War, when usually in military exercises and even diplomatic exercises, war games in the diplomatic sphere, The friendlies would be called the blue team or the blue force, and the opposition would be called the red force. And there were players who would try to emulate the decision making of, say, the Soviet leadership. Given everything we knew through intelligence, what would they do in certain scenarios? Play that out. So it's looking at the world from the perspective of the other guy. That's the fundamental part of a red team, and this book does that. And it is the one thing that the biggest difference, I guess, I think, from most other histories on World War II. It's obsessively focused on the thinking among the Axis leaders. Now, you have to talk about Blue Force now and again because often the Axis powers were reacting to American policy. But the core story is about why they made this decision. And Chris said, "Yeah, it's crazy." And in fact, that was the reason I started on this project. There was an editor who rejected my book, Fighting Patton, which was looking at George Patton through the eyes of his enemies. And he said, "Well, that's not really a very interesting question to me. What does intrigue me is why did it make sense to the Axis leaders to go to war against America, given everything that the world knew about its industrial power and its ability to mobilize?" And so I decided that was actually kind of a cool question, and I set off on it.
So Harry, what I think that would be helpful, and one of the things that I've been curious about is when does your timeline begin? Because when you look at historical events, you can say, well, this is the beginning of this process that led to that. And how long is the tail? So when do you start this countdown? When does it become an issue for these people?
Well, in the case of Japan, 1880, there's a long timeline in the case of Japan, starting with the modernization of the Japanese military in the 1880s and 1890s. And when they built up a European-style military force, the war minister told the emperor, "Look, we can't fight our wars defending the Japanese homeland from foreign invaders." And when they talked about that, their main fear was the Russians. He said, we have to push our defenses forward. And the Japanese set about doing exactly that. I found it intriguing because it's analogous to the U.S. forward defense strategy during the Cold War. I mean, the big difference was that the United States went about it through mutually beneficial military alliances, economic alliances, and so forth. And the Japanese did it by conquering other people. But you see over the years a gradual pushing forward. 1905, they beat the Russians and become a global naval power. And the Treaty of Portsmouth, which Teddy Roosevelt brokered, gives them a right to exert influence, or be the primary influence in Korea, and a stake in protecting the safety of a railroad line in Manchuria. All of this has big implications down the road. In 1907, the Japanese picked the American fleet as their notional enemy for their budget. And in 1909, they picked the American fleet as their notional enemy for everything, force structure, ship construction, and so on. And by the 1930s, all of their fleet exercises are a decisive battle against the U.S. Navy. The German track starts later than that, after World War I. And early on, Hitler and German decision making was a one-person operation. It was Adolf. The Japanese leadership was really complicated. It was a collective leadership. They never had a dictator. Tojo was not a dictator. He didn't even take power until not long before Pearl Harbor, and they kicked him out of office in summer of 1944 for incompetent leadership. But after World War I, Hitler had a certain degree of respect for the United States and its industrial power. Um, but I'm not sure what happened in his mind. By the time he took power, he was making plans for Europe without even thinking about the United States.
Yeah.
He was embarrassed by an American journalist who asked him after he had become prime minister, Bundeskanzler, what he thought about the United States, and he grew red in the face and stumbled and finally said, "I haven't had time to think about America."
Well, yeah, in fact, I don't want to jump in here, Rick.
No,
But
go
Yeah.
ahead.
I was really kind of shocked. I mean, you get into this in much greater detail. Maybe we can talk more about it, but I don't want to say if casual is the right word, but the Germans have no plan. I mean, there's a lot of time spent on the Japanese looking at America, and you talked about that, but some of these you have a quote in the book that says the German army, however, considered the possibility of fighting the Americans such a remote prospect that on the day Adolf Hitler declared war, the general staff did not even have data gathered to make an initial assessment of U.S. intentions and capabilities.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And
That's
as I said, Hitler was the single decision maker, and he was convinced prior to the war that the United States would not get involved under any circumstances.
Right.
And the German embassy in 1936, that's what they told Berlin. Nobody here wants to get involved in a European war. But as things got dicier and dicier, they started warning that if France and Britain faced defeat in a war, America would probably fight. But Hitler, he just dismissed that. He dismissed any possibility of America getting involved in the war until early 1941, when he finally conceded that, yeah, it was possible, but America couldn't influence anything until it fully mobilized in 1942. And he was confident that he could accomplish all of his aims in Europe before the Americans made any difference. I mean, he knew that the Americans would supply Britain with a lot of raw materials and arms and stuff like that, but he was thinking purely in military terms. And it, in April 1941, Japanese Foreign Minister Matsuoka is visiting Europe, and he's in Berlin talking to Hitler. And Hitler, without having, as best I can tell, talked to anybody else about this, I mean, you would think they would do some basic studies about the implications, but he says to Matsuoka, if you go to war against America, Germany will quickly join the conflict. So April 1940, psychologically, Hitler has crossed the line to war against America. And does he order the military to start looking into it? No. And they don't. So the day he declares war, there's a great anecdote in Walter Warmont's biography, or I'm sorry, autobiography, and he he says that he gets a call from Jodl, who's the chief of operations for the high command, and he says, we're going to need an appraisal of the Americans' capabilities and what they're likely to do. And he says, given that we have not been considering them as an enemy combatant, we have no information on which to base this assessment. And Jodl says, well, do the best you can. I mean, it's remarkable. One man. And the day he declared war, he admitted privately he had no idea how he could beat the United States in a war. No idea. So yeah, it was sort of an off the cuff kind of thing. But
you talk about really with both Japan and Germany, and we'll circle back to Japan because they very carefully analyzed the situation and drew some very false conclusions. But you talk about the dogs that didn't bark, right? Factors that might have been important in Germany and Japan's analysis of the United States, except for the fact that either they didn't know about them, so they couldn't include them in their analysis, or they didn't understand how little they knew about them, maybe in terms of U.S. production. Can you elaborate on some of the dogs that didn't bark?
Oh, sure, absolutely. And in intelligence, it's often what's not happening that ought to be happening that tells you something is going on. Well, for both the European and Japanese Axis powers, uh, I think uh, the biggest thing they couldn't know that really critically hurt them was they had no idea that the Americans and British were going to crack their codes. And that happened early on. And by March 1942, the Americans were reading practically all of Japan's communications. The British had cracked the Enigma system, and it ebbed and flowed. The Germans would change things, but basically, when it came to military affairs in particular, everything the Axis was doing was an open book to the Americans. And in the case of Japan in particular, this led to a string of huge naval defeats because the Americans knew they were coming, where they were coming, and it led to the crippling of their ability to ship raw materials from all the territory they conquered. Just a side note, the Japanese achieved their war aims by early 1942. There was a U.S. intelligence assessment that said no other country in history has controlled the natural resource wealth that Japan does now, but they had to get the stuff to Japan. And all of their convoys, the Americans knew where they were going, when they were going, and could send submarines out to sink them. So that was one. They also both failed to anticipate strategic air warfare, and in the case of Japan, they actually thought about it. I mean, they realized it was a risk, but they for a while sort of thought they could keep American bombers far enough away from Japan that there was no super danger. But they thought about it. The Germans, when they started the war, they had the best air defense system in Europe. And there's the famous Goering boast that if the British ever bomb the Ruhr Valley, you can call me Meyer or something like that. They were confident, but they were aware that the Americans had built the B-17, a self-protecting strategic bomber, and the Luftwaffe was designed as an infantry support air force. That was its mission, providing ground support. And they were utterly unprepared when the British bombed Hamburg and destroyed the city. Within the German leadership, they talked seriously about if that happened many more times, they might not be able to continue the war. And I mean, the strategic bombing didn't critically hurt their war effort until after D-Day, but it forced the Germans to spend huge sums of money they couldn't spend on other stuff, building flak anti-aircraft guns, building bunkers, cleaning up damage, rebuilding factories that were bombed. So that was a shared dog that didn't bark that they didn't take into account. Of course, Japan did not take the atomic bomb into account. Japanese scientists had told the leadership that nobody would be able to build the atom bomb during the war, and that was a big mistake. And again, neither Germany nor Japan anticipated just how massively powerful American military industry was going to be.
I want to jump in on that,
Yeah.
and Chris, if it's okay, because the U.S. is kind of an open book.
Yep.
I mean, it is today, and it probably was, as far as I know, in the late 1930s, early 1940s. You can see how big it is. You can see the industry that's there. It doesn't seem terribly hard to do the math and figure out what they can produce, and that if
Yeah.
they are going all into it. So why was this missed? Why was this not taken into account? And why didn't somebody go, well, wait a minute, we don't want to piss those guys off,
Yeah.
Because if they go all in, we are screwed.
So the answer is different for Germany and Japan. Let me say that the Italian foreign minister, Count Ciano, he was a steely-eyed realist, and he really was worried about the Americans getting involved in the war. Um, Mussolini wound up drinking Hitler's Kool-Aid, but on the day of Pearl Harbor, Ciano told the Italian king, America's military production is just going to swamp us. It's going to be critical. Now, in the case of Japan, uh, they knew what America's um, industrial potential was, but during the fairly detailed considerations before the decision to attack Pearl Harbor, um, during the liaison conference, that was how the Japanese formulated policy. All of the civilian and military organizations would get together and come up with a joint policy that would then go to the cabinet for approval and then to the emperor for approval. And they talked about things like projected American production of bombers. They knew very well what America's naval expansion was all about because, like you said, it was all in the newspapers. And in fact, it was one reason that Admiral Nagano, the Navy Chief of Staff, said, "We've got to fight now. We've got to fight now," because by 1944, they're just simply going to swamp us with naval superiority. And they had a pretty good picture in Japan of America's ability to mobilize manpower. Uh, but at these discussions, the guy who was there from the Economic Bureau said in an interrogation report after the war, "I'm sitting there and I realize everybody here has already made the decision. We're going to go to war." So he didn't bother to trouble them with statistics
Facts.
on America's ability to produce steel and all these other things. So it just kind of dropped to the floor. And when it went to the emperor, they talked about all these other things, but not that. Now, in the case of Germany, there is firm evidence that he and his henchmen and Mussolini simply did not believe what the Americans were publishing. They simply didn't believe it was possible. And there's one occasion where the American ambassador had circulated something about American tank production, and they both break out laughing and characterize it as childish that they're putting this kind of stuff out.
Because presumably because the Americans are saying they're going to make X amount of tanks that they couldn't possibly make.
They couldn't possibly do that. And I have a theory for which I have no evidence, and I admit this in the book. It's just a theory. Hitler had gone through this massive industrial mobilization, and he had encountered unexpected roadblocks and bottlenecks and all sorts of things like that. And so he thought all of this was going to happen to the Americans too. So it was going to take them a long, long time. And if you look back at World War I, our military mobilization was pretty ineffective. Our army fought in Europe with British and French tanks, with French artillery, with British and French airplanes. Um, our mobilization effort wasn't very good, which is why it was good in the Second World War, because we learned a big lesson from that and set up a system, an organized system for military industrial mobilization with experts in the military working with industry and so on. So, when they turned the gas on in the US, man, everybody was ready to go. They knew exactly what to do. And Hitler had nothing like that when he was doing it in Germany. So my bet is that he just thought they're going to have the same problems, and the U.S. did hit roadblocks. The Army wanted 200 divisions, and there came a day when Roosevelt was told, "If you want to meet your airplane target, we can't we can't make all those tanks and artillery pieces and stuff. So what do you want?" And Roosevelt said airplanes. So the Army cut its force projection in half. So, that kind of thing, it did affect even the United States.
So Harry, we're gonna I thought we might bounce around a bit. We're getting a lot of questions, and I wanted to
Sure.
get some of them in. So, so excuse me if it seems like they're all over the place. We're getting a lot of kind of interesting questions. So, just for start, Lynn Hargrove asked, was the Japanese fixation on the U.S. known to U.S. military leaders and thinkers? Were they aware that they were being looked at as
We're the enemy since 1907.
Right. Oh, yes. They America was aware of it, and the U.S. ambassador in Tokyo was sending cables back saying, Japan may well go crazy and go to war against us, and so Roosevelt knew this, but I guess. I mean, I didn't look at the American side of this, so I don't want to say too much about why Pearl Harbor was such a surprise. It shouldn't have been a surprise because when the military did its war plans, it based them on the assumption that Japan would stage a surprise attack, and there were all sorts of tidbits coming in that Pearl Harbor was under discussion as a target. But for some reason, for whatever reason, we were asleep when it happened. But yes, the United States was very well aware that Japan was thinking about war with the United States, and there were American naval officers who wanted to go to war with Japan. So there was a little bit of that going on too.
Well, also another question, and a couple of people have asked this question, thanks to James M., but I'll put up David Picker's version of it, which is, didn't Yamamoto warn against awakening the sleeping giant, that being the United States? And when James M. asked this question, he said, didn't Yamamoto think that the U.S. was ready for war when he saw a newsreel of the 41 Louisiana maneuvers? So what was Yamamoto aware and warning? Was he a canary in the coal mine or not?
Well, yes, I haven't heard the anecdote about the maneuvers. That's kind of interesting. But if he thought that based on those maneuvers, he was wrong. I mean, the U.S. Army wasn't ready for war at that point. In any event, yes, Yamamoto had been.
So I just want to clarify, because you know what, I misread James M.'s question, and he said, I read that Admiral Yamamoto didn't think the U.S. was ready for war when he saw the newsreel of the 41 Louisiana maneuvers. So you got David Picker saying, was he warning against the sleeping giant? And James M. saying, was he really convinced that we weren't ready because of the Louisiana maneuvers?
Well, okay, so Yamamoto opposed war. He opposed the Tripartite Pact. He and Admiral Yonai were the two senior figures in the Navy who didn't want to ally with the Germans at all. And there are various stories about what Yamamoto said. I chose to use the one that was left by Prime Minister Kanoya, who asked Yamamoto what he expected to happen. And Yamamoto said, I don't have the quote right in front of me, that he thought the fleet could fight very effectively for about a year, and after that, he didn't have much confidence. And it was because he was aware that the Americans were going to be able to way outproduce Japan, that it was going to be difficult to replace losses of ships, whereas the Americans would be able to replace ships. He was particularly concerned about air power. He was the father of Japanese naval aviation. He created the military katana that was the Japanese carrier force that was so effective earlier in the war. And he thought eventually that they'd just wear themselves out and not be able to rebuild. But yeah, he had been to the United States, and he was well aware of America's industrial potential.
All right, so we have one more question here, and we'll get caught up and then kind of continue on. But this is from David.
Maybe we'll continue on.
Maybe, yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
We might just go in 8 directions.
That's true.
Because it's History Happy Hour. The alcohol's kicking in.
You're a wise man, Harry.
We loosen up a little bit. Yeah.
But David, we keep talking about the Axis powers when we talk about Germany and Japan, and because we know how it all turns out, there's a third part of the Axis powers that gets sort of dismissed, but certainly in the 1920s and 1930s, Italy is a major factor in all of this, and we should probably address this. And David Picker has asked, what about Italy? So what sort of assessments are Italy making? How are they influencing this at all? I know you talked about Count Sieno saying, hey, this is not a good idea. Where are they in all of this?
Sure. Well, we have an excellent documentary record of Hitler and Mussolini's discussions with foreign ministers involved. We also have Count Ciano's diary, which the Germans captured and conveniently for me translated into German, and which was ordered destroyed at the end of the war, but hidden by a secretary under a rose bush and survived the
As
war
you do.
to be
Yeah.
in the National Archives. Mussolini, for a period in early 1940, was really worried about the Americans getting involved. But Hitler kept saying, "No, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen." And and Mussolini sort of came around to that view that Roosevelt was all bark and no bite. Now, Mussolini didn't even want to start the war when Hitler started it. He kept trying to get Hitler to put war off until 1943 or 1944 because, he told Hitler, we are not ready. We don't have the industrial power yet to wage a huge conflict. And when Hitler went to war against Poland, Mussolini said, "Look, we can't come in with you guys on this." And even when Hitler invaded France, Mussolini waited until it was obvious that the French were shot before Italy finally declared war and went in. And again, this is mostly from Ciano. He talks about all the things that the Italian military was telling them about how they had these modern armored divisions and whatever else, and he was always skeptical about the real fighting power of the Italian military. And Italy could not have lasted as long in the war as it did without turning to Germany for supplies of raw materials, anti-aircraft guns. So yeah, Italy was definitely the tail on the dog.
Yeah.
I want to remind everybody that we are chatting today with Harry Yeide, who is the author of Betting Against America, the Axis Powers Views of the United States. Harry, we've been talking a lot about Hitler and Germany, I guess we've been talking about all three, but Japan, as you point out, did a lot of analysis before the war started about the U.S. as an enemy and how could they beat them, and they concluded that this was, as you write, the right war at the right time. They thought it was winnable against the United States. Now they've presumably got some view of the U.S. ability to put forth manpower and put forth industrial bases. So how do they come to the conclusion that Japan can beat the U.S.? I guess really the question is what's the strategy that doesn't quite work out because there's an interception early in the game or whatever. But what's the strategy that doesn't work out?
Yeah, so getting back to timeline, there's actually a pretty cool baseline point in 1933 after Japan had invaded Manchuria. And there was an international hue and cry led by the United States, among others, and the Japanese pull out of the League of Nations. And at that time, the collective Japanese leadership transmitted abroad a strategic appraisal of Japan's relations with the United States. And it said, well, one thing it said was, there are people in Japan who want to go to war with America right now. But when we look at the prospects for a war with the United States, we conclude that there is absolutely no way that we can defeat the United States. There's no way we can compel them to come to terms or drive them out of the war, and that any war with America would be protracted and inevitably go against Japan. So, 1933, even the military is signing off on this rational policy um, that you shouldn't do it. But simultaneously, at this point, there is a doctrine that comes into favor called quick war, quick victory, and the idea is that if you win big and fast, that you should be okay, right? And when the Japanese invaded China, they thought that's what they were going to get into. They looked back at the Frank or the Prussian uh, Austro-Prussian War. I'm sorry, of 1868, when Germany slapped Austria-Hungary around, or Prussia did, and established itself as the senior brother in an alliance that lasted through World War One. They thought they were going to slap Chiang Kai-shek around, and that the Chinese would realize they had to become the junior brother in a partnership with Japan. Well, Chiang knew he was going to have to fight, and he had a plan himself to pull all his military industry and government into deep into China and wage a war of attrition. So that's what Japan got. But anyway, this fallacy that you could win big and it would be over had taken root. And the Japanese plan was to create an impervious defense line. And the line they selected, they achieved. They overran all their planned territory faster and at lower costs than they expected. And they believed that they could hold that line against all comers, and that America would eventually get tired of losing lives and realize that there was simply no way to win the war, and would accede to Japanese control over everything it had taken. Um, they had no plan B. They talked a little bit about going to the Vatican to use as an intermediary if they had to have some sort of conversation with America. But no, there was no plan B. They had the arrogance to believe that they could hold this perimeter. That was the plan. And in fact, they did so well that Tojo in February 1942 says, "We want more." And this really got them into some trouble because they agreed to expand the perimeter. And one of those expansions was they sent the fleet into the Indian Ocean. It's a totally, in America, forgotten part of the war. But they sank a British aircraft carrier and bombed Ceylon and so on. That went okay, but part of that plan later was to invade India, and that was a disaster. Part of the plan was they were going to take northern New Guinea, and they were doing so well, they said, no, let's take the whole darn island, Port Moresby. And that led to the Battle of Coral Sea, where, because of intercepts, the Americans got aircraft carriers there, did enough damage to the Japanese carrier covering force that the invasion fleet turned around. And that was Japan's first strategic setback in the war. It also cost them two damaged aircraft carriers that weren't at Midway. And Midway was part of the expansion plan. And it took on some urgency after Doolittle's raid on Tokyo, because those bombers had launched from aircraft carriers. And all of a sudden, the idea of controlling Midway looked even better because you could intercept carrier task forces and keep them from taking bombers close to Japan. And likewise, the Aleutians, they were afraid American bombers would stage there.
So, Harry, we've been talking a lot about planning, war planning, getting ready for all this. You have a quote from Admiral Ugaki on New Year's Day of 1942, and says, "The future is full of brightness." And we've just talked a little bit about that, but clearly, not too long after that, things start to turn sideways, and you can say 1942 is the year when things start to change. When does the light bulb go off for Germany and Japan, if it ever does, and how does that change kind of their thinking and to get back to the title of your book, their views of America?
Yeah. So let's start with Japan. The defeat at at Midway convinced some Japanese admirals that the war was not going to turn out very well. Admiral Ugaki was an exception. His reaction to the defeat was, well, we still have a substantial carrier fleet, and war is unpredictable, and we'll be able to bounce back from this. He was highly confident, even after Midway, that they were going to win. The landings on Guadalcanal, surprisingly enough, had a big impact on Japanese thinking about the war. They thought that they could send some first-rate army units down there and quickly clean the island, and it was a disaster for them. They lost heavily on the naval side, and their ground forces were pretty much wiped out, and they had to leave. And that was a big shock. That was a huge shock to the army in particular. They thought, the Bushido Code and Japanese heroism and all that was going to carry the day. And it was after that the keeper of the Privy Seal said he thought the war plan was going off the rails. By mid-1943, it was this late in the war, it was just occurring to the Japanese that the war in the Pacific was their big problem, not the war in China, because the army had continued to devote almost all of its resources to the war in China during this period. A lot of Navy resources were over there. And it was in September 1943 that the Japanese formally said, all right, we're going on the defensive. And at a conference in the imperial presence, Admiral Nagano said, I cannot guarantee victory. And a history written by the officer who was head of the Army General Staff operations section said, the room went silent. The room went silent when the admiral said that. But Tojo stepped in and said, oh, no, we can still win this war. But by that early in the war, it was some reality was setting in. Now, as everybody probably knows, Yamamoto was shot down thanks to intercepted messages, and his replacement was a guy named Admiral Koga. And in February 1944, Koga, who is now commander of the entire Pacific Theater, says that if the Marshall Islands fall, Japan will have lost the war. And of course, the Marshall Islands fall in the summer of 1944. He's dead by then, but that was a clear strategic statement that he acknowledged one point of failure. After that, we're finished. The Imperial General Staff in January 1945 did a study that estimated that Japan's ability to wage organized warfare would end sometime in mid-1945, and the Americans would invade the home islands soon after that. So that was obviously the military's realization that they were going to lose, but of course they were determined to fight to the death and defend the home islands. It would have been a big bloody thing. In April 1945, a new government formed in Japan under Admiral Suzuki, and the emperor let it be known that he wanted Suzuki to find a way to end the war. So at that point, you could say the emperor has clearly internalized the fact that Japan is losing the war. On the German side, first answer is when it came to the military professionals, Jodl said that the war in the West was lost the day that the Allies broke out of Normandy and the Battle of Movement began. So the professional military knew that early. That
there's only one decision maker.
Right. And well, And that's right. There's only one decision maker. He, at least on the 31st of August, conceded that he was going to have to give up France. They were going to have to run away to the German border. But yeah, I had a question. Did Hitler ever really acknowledge it? And I found a book that was a translation of a Soviet document that had been prepared for Stalin that included interviews with some of Hitler's closest adjutants. And his military adjutant told a story about how a week before he shot himself, he came into the war room and he stopped and he said something like, "Ah, I don't know how this has happened. This has never happened to me before. I can no longer command. The war is lost." A week before he kills himself. So at least,
Hey, better late than
Better
never.
late than never,
better
yeah.
late than never. Yeah.
I always think it was like about the time that he found out that the Steiner attack wasn't happening, is about when he figured it out. Um, and yeah, I mean, so is there any looking back by people who are taking part in the war, military people in Japan or in Germany, afterwards, where they go, wow, what the heck were we thinking? We were just so far off base. Or are these guys still in denial when their countries are in ashes?
Um, well, I don't have documentary evidence. I mean, I think we can all imagine that they looked back and thought, ooh, that was a mistake. But, they're professional warriors. And their job isn't to think about mistakes of the past. Their job is to fight as effectively as they can until they're told to stop. So, yeah, I doubt they lost a whole lot of sleep over that. It was what it was, as they say.
So, Harry, you have, we're covering a lot of ground. There's a lot more in the book, obviously, but at the conclusion of your book, you have a subhead that asks, could the Axis powers have fought a better war? And so the question is, could they? Where did they go wrong? What did they miss? Could they have done something different?
Well, my conclusion to that is no, not really. I mean, their original sin was declaring war against the United States, and in every case, they took the initiative. The United States did not declare war against Germany. Germany declared war against the United States. Likewise Italy, and obviously Japan. Uh, but yeah, in the case of Germany, they were just so far out of their depth with the alliance arrayed against them. Because it wasn't just America, the Soviets were producing all sorts of war material. Um, if you look at, or if you read the book, there are some tables on military output, and it was really only in bombers where the United States produced more than the rest of the world combined. So there are a lot of allies producing a lot of military equipment, and Hitler's industrialists at one point told him that we can't win on the basis of military production. You need to find a way to make peace. And Hitler's retort was, and gentlemen, tell me how I am supposed to do that. To which, of course, they had no answer. Um, I mean, the Japanese, it was arrogance. They thought they were so good at what they did that they could pull it off. And they tried adjusting strategy during the war. They suffered such heavy losses of carriers, but more importantly, naval aviators, that the carrier arm was out of business by 1944, and they went back to the decisive battle strategy that they had planned on before Yamamoto revolutionized warfare, and they twice tried to implement the decisive battle at the Battle of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, but the Americans knew they were coming. And they both turned from a decisive battle. Well, they were decisive battles that Japan lost. So no, I can't imagine how they could have fought a better war and done any better.
Might it have helped if they had coordinated better. I think that you read about this, and there's this kind of, they're both hesitating to really be united and try to do things together. If Germany and Japan had been more tightly allied, would that have given them a benefit?
Um, I again, I'm not sure. I can see how, but I will say this: that the Japanese were the only party that saw the war as a global conflict. Germany thought of it as a European conflict. That was the context they looked at. But the Japanese, they were very sensitive to what was going on in Europe. For example, when the Anglo-American landings, Operation Torch, occurred in November 1942, the Japanese were alarmed about this. They said that now the Americans are on the offensive, and this is going to have a big impact on neutral countries that we depend on for certain things. When Tunis fell, there was a big discussion among Japanese embassies in Europe and the foreign ministry in Tokyo, and they concluded that the Allies were going to move on from North Africa, knock Italy out of the war, and they were going to land in France. And Germany had just suffered a drubbing at Stalingrad, and it wasn't looking so good for them. And they actually one embassy actually said, Japan needs to start thinking about having to fight this war on alone. So they saw all these consequences. But yeah, the Germans in particular were absolutely uninterested in operational coordination. The Japanese kept suggesting it, but never got anywhere.
So Harry, you talk about this being sort of a red team study and getting into the Axis powers kind of cycle of thought and
Hmm.
whatnot. And you're an intelligence veteran, professional. Is there anything that you discovered as you were researching this, surprised you, changed how you looked at the war? What did you take away from all the work that you did on this?
Well, I guess I was surprised that the Japanese had spent so long thinking about going to war. That was totally new to me, um, and I was surprised that the Germans, who were no slouches at warfare, did no preparation for it whatsoever before it came to pass. That was a surprise. Um, but in terms of the psychology, it, I guess I didn't find it surprising that the Japanese talked themselves into the whole thing. I mean, we haven't talked about that really. Why did Japan go to war against America? It went to war because it couldn't win the war in China. Um, it by 1940, the Japanese army in China was fought out, and the Imperial General Staff concluded that it could not win the war militarily. And so the new cabinet formed in July 1940, and it did a huge strategic reappraisal of the war situation, and it agreed we can't win the war military as things stand. So they came up with two ideas. One was to try to reach a deal with Chang, and that didn't go anywhere, of course. And the other was they talked themselves into believing that if they cut off the supply of foreign military support to the nationalist army, that then they could win militarily. But that meant they had to occupy Southeast Asia, French Indochina, Burma, which was British. So doing this meant going to war with Britain, which probably meant going to war with the United States, which probably meant that the Americans were going to cut off all their oil supplies, which meant, hey, we have to invade the Dutch East Indies to get all the oil that's there and all the other raw materials so we can sustain the war effort. And that is the driving force in their decision making. And only as a side effect, they say, well, we're going to have all these invasion fleets to overrun that territory. And the Americans have moved the fleet to Pearl Harbor. And they pose a real menace to all these operations. So hey, Navy, you have to figure out a way to cripple the fleet in Pearl Harbor. So it was only as a kind of side effect of this thinking that Yamamoto had to come up with a plan to cripple the fleet at Pearl Harbor. But you can see them getting caught up in this in this thinking, kind of mystical thinking that, yeah, there's just, if we can only fix this problem, the flow of weapons into China, then we can manage it. But it occurred to me that this was not unique to Japan. You look at the way the U.S. fought the World War in Vietnam. Well, we thought it made sense to start conflicts in Cambodia and Laos to cut off the flow of supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, right? So I guess that when you're a policymaker, expanding your problem set just suddenly seems like a good idea.
Good idea.
We see two foes of the U.S. One engages in a great deal of planning. One acts, like you said, pretty much like a drunken uncle in deciding to go to war, and both of them are wrong. So that's kind of the story spelled out by Harry Yeide in his book that we've been talking about today, Betting Against America, the Axis Powers Views of the United States. Harry, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour. It's been so great to have you here.
Thank you. It was
really
a lot of fun.
I hope so. I hope you finish that beer and, have another when you get off if you want.
You bet.
But thank you so much.
Thanks, Harry.
Chris, next week we're still into World War II. We've been on a run here. We're still live. We're still into World War II. We'll try to get that Facebook stuff fixed, guys. But otherwise, join us on YouTube because that seems to be no problem. But next week we will interview Rona Simmons, who's the author of the book No Average Day, which tells the story of one day in World War II. And Chris, I think this is a great topic. Do you know why I think it's a great topic?
Because she beat you to it because you wanted to do it, but
yes, I wanted to write that book.
Even though it was your idea.
I have the proposal. I'm sure that she developed it completely separately. She picked a different day. So, if she'd stolen my idea, she would have picked my day, which was like September 14th, I think.
So that I can actually look forward to you lecturing her next week.
Yes, I'm going to totally come into this with it. Well, I had done, and I, yeah. So that is definitely my, honestly, that's my approach to every show, is how it affects me, and
it gives me something to look for.
What I would have done on that topic if
you'd only gotten off your ass and done it.
I know, right? What is the problem? I've got all these books that I wanted to. Now we're getting into confessional.
You can level the same accusation at me, so
I'll let you level it at yourself.
Okay.
In the dark of night, there in Dresden.
There is Dresden.
Guys, thank you for joining us. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.